All right, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. It's time for another exciting lightning talk. I'm Parag Katkar, your host for tonight. I'm the head of consulting practices here at InRhythm, and we have a lot of exciting content lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. Our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And each week, one of our practice area consultants speaks on the latest technology trends in the industry that will help you keep learning and growing in your career. And this week, Nikolai Tarasov, who is a passionate iOS engineer, is going to go over CocoaPods, which is a dependency manager for Swift and Objective-C. And I'm super excited for this talk. So without further ado, let's get it started, Nikolai.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Nikolai, iOS engineer with InRhythm. So today I'm going to talk about CocoaPods. So CocoaPods itself, it's a huge topic. There's lots of things to discuss, but in today's lightning talk, I'm trying to cover some things. So let's get started. Okay. Yeah. So today we'll talk about what is CocoaPods. And what are the main components of CocoaPods, how to install it on your machine, and what is going on behind the scenes when you run pod install command, so we understand like all the processes CocoaPods is doing. Okay, so CocoaPods is a dependency management tool for Objective-C, Swift, or any other programming language that run on Objective-C runtime. CocoaPods has over 93,000 libraries and is used in over 3 million apps. So it's widely used, and I think most of the iOS engineers worked with it, if not all. Also, CocoaPods built with Ruby, and it's packaged as a Ruby gem. CocoaPods was developed by a small group of dedicated engineers back in 2011, August 2011. Later on, it was it received good feedback from the engineering community, and more volunteers joined and helped to grow it. So it has pretty strong community support. Yeah, as I mentioned, it was like the development started in August 2011, and on September 1st, 2011, they made the first public release. So CocoaPods been available for a while, like 11 years already. Let's look what are the ingredients, what is inside of CocoaPods. So CocoaPods, it's a Ruby gem, but it's also made of several Ruby gems. So the most important gems when we're talking about integration process are CocoaPods. So it's a CocoaPod gem inside of CocoaPods, and then core and Xcode Proj gems. So basically, CocoaPods gem is a user-facing component, and it's doing its job when you run pod command in the terminal. Core gem provides support for working with files that are involved with CocoaPods. Mainly, it's pod file and pod specs. So pod file is a file where you define all the pods which you want to use. We'll talk a little bit more about pod file in a minute. The pod spec file determines how a particular pod is going to be added to the project. You can it supports features like a listen source files, frameworks, compile flags, or any other dependencies that the library requires. And the third gem is Xcode Proj, and from its name, you may guess it's that gem which handles all the project file interactions, like creating of Xcode project file, SC, XC workspace file, or modification of those files. Yeah, here's the example of pod file. Pod file uses Ruby language. It's a good DSL language, and you can define pod file as simple as shown on the first example, or it may be more complex, like on the example below, or it may be even more complex, and it's not shown here, but you know, like if you work with CocoaPods, it can be quite large, complex, and you may have like multiple pods in it, configurations, and all of that. Also wanted to talk about adding pods into a pod file. On this example, you can see we have two pods, objective sugar. So we can add like external pods to the pod file, or some local repository from our like a local machine. So we have pretty much flexibility here. This all is given by like CocoaPods. So here on this example, just giving an example how you can add a pod like a Git repository. You may add your like custom framework. You can specify which branch you want to use. Like on the first example, if you don't specify branch, it just redirects to master branch, or you can specify dev branch, tag, or even commit. So just you can specify that. Yeah, there's lots of stuff to discuss about pod file itself, what you can do with it, how you can add the pods. As I mentioned, you can also add pods which are local on your machine. It's similar to the example shown on the screenshot, but just you specify path to that repository. Yeah. Also wanted to show an example of podspec file. So podspec file, it's a file which specifies which files will be, so it's added for the library, which is going to be added to the project as a pod. It's also it's used quite extensively, especially for like a library. It's used in enterprise app, complex apps, when you just wrap some code into a library and pull it into the main app as a dependency. So you use this podspec in that library, and you specify all these like required parameters. Also, it's just an example. It may look different in the like a specific library. Just to give an idea, so that's the example. Yeah, so how to install CocoaPods on macOS. So first, usually when someone wants to install CocoaPods, the command to do it is a sudo gem install CocoaPods. But this command doesn't always work, especially for those who started using M1 Max. So basically, if you are M1 Mac user and you got troubles with installing CocoaPods using this command, you may try a different route. And I was one of those people who stuck with installing CocoaPods on M1 Mac. So there's another route to do it by installing Homebrew first. And I will explain every single command here. So basically, if the first command sudo gem install CocoaPods doesn't work, then you can try to install Homebrew. And to install Homebrew, you can run this command, bin bash, and the rest. And also, second command below with the proxy.com 800. So I just gave this example because sometimes you may be like you are trying to install CocoaPods on an enterprise, like a work Mac or enterprise machine with VPN proxy, and it can be a bit like a nightmare when you try to deal with VPN and proxy. And I went through that, and just wanted to give this example that basically to install Homebrew on machine which has VPN proxy, you just need to specify proxy domain and port. It can be 8000, and then it should bypass proxy, and you should be able to install Homebrew. For some of you who doesn't know how to get this proxy domain, because on this example, it's just an example proxy.com, but it's not actual proxy server. I can show you how I did it, just real quick. To get this exact domain, proxy domain, you may go to system settings on your machine, go to Wi-Fi, your Wi-Fi, connected Wi-Fi details, and then switch to proxy. It may be different because I have Ventura on my machine. On the previous macOS version, it's a bit different, but you'll figure it out. And here you will have automatic proxy configuration on. So this is I don't have any proxy set on this machine, but if you do, then you can come here, and here you will see the URL for the PAC file or .dat file. And if you you can download that file and see what proxy servers are used. And I tried a couple of servers, and the third one worked for me. So I mean, I dived into details a bit, but so that's how you can get the proxy domain and specify it for this command and install Homebrew. So we try to install Homebrew. You may need to run the next two commands to add brew as a terminal command. And then finally, when you got brew installed, you may check if brew is installed by running which brew. If you can see Homebrew version, means it's installed. And finally, you can run brew install CocoaPods. And that should be, that should install CocoaPods. You can also run which CocoaPods. Make sure that CocoaPods is installed. So after CocoaPods is installed, you can navigate to a project file, and then all these commands, pod init, it creates pod file. And then once you add all the required pods configurations into pod file, you can run pod install. If pod install fails, just want to give a tip that you may try to run pod rep update just to update your current specs. And another issue which may arise when you run this pod install or pod rep update, you may get an error saying something that you need to install using arc. So you may try to add this prefix to your command, which is shown on example arc 8664. Yeah, so that's about setting up CocoaPods. And few more useful commands which are mostly used when you deal with CocoaPods. We talk about pod install. It's used initially, and then when you add or remove pods, pod outdated, used more rare than pod install, but still it's also useful command just to see if there's new versions for pods available. Pod update pulls, updates pods to a new version if new version is available. And pod integrate, it's also a useful command to remove all pods from the project. Especially it's helpful when you got some issues with CocoaPods and you try to run pod update, it doesn't help. Then you just try to get rid of all pods and run pod integrate, so it removes all pods from the project, and then run pod install just to reinstall all the pods. And it's helpful in many cases, not all, but many cases. And also one more note here, that there is a misconception that pod update is used after a certain pod is removed or added. So pod install is for this specific case. If you add or remove a pod, you should run pod install. Pod update just to get a newer version of pod if it's available. And to get a better idea what is going on under the hood when we run pod install, what are the processes, we'll talk about that. So when we run pod install, there are multiple steps which are done one by one. So first of all, CocoaPods is reading pod file where we specify all the pods we need to add to the project. And CocoaPods just goes through this and makes list of all pods by loading pod specs. And these pod specs are stored locally in CocoaPods folder. So next, loading sources of those pods. So each pod spec contains a reference to files. Usually it's a git remote or tag. And these references are resolved to commit SHS, and they're stored in cache's CocoaPods folder. These files created in those directories, and this is the responsibility of core gem, which we mentioned already. And then the source files downloaded to the pods directory using the information from the pod file, pod spec, and cache. After this, the next step is generating the pods Xcode proj. So every time pod install is run, the changes detected, and pods Xcode project file is updated using Xcode proj gem. If file doesn't exist, it will create one with default settings. Otherwise, it will just take the existing settings which are stored in the memory. So the next step, installing libraries. So basically, when CocoaPods adds a library to the project, a few more additional files are being added. Just briefly wanted to mention this couple of files which are xcconfig, which contains build settings, another private xcconfig which merges these build settings with the full CocoaPods configuration. Also prefix pch and dummy.m, which are required for building. Just if you see these files, you'll know where they come from. After this is done for every single pod target, overall pod target is created. This adds the same files with the addition of few more. So like a couple of more files been added, which are pods resources sh and pods environment.h, which has some macros for you to check whether a component comes from a pod. And other files are being added, which one plist file and markdown file that just help end users to conform with licensing. So these are all files which are being added when libraries are installed. And the last step is writing to a disk. So until now, all this work is being stored in a memory. And here, like to make this work reproducible, this needs to be recorded in a file. So pods Xcode project files written to disk, along with two other very important files, which are podfile.log and manifest.log. So yeah, these files, you may see it if you deal with CocoaPods, and we will talk about it now. So podfile.log is one of the most important files that CocoaPods creates. It keeps track of all the resolved versions of pods that needs to be installed. If you want to check like what version of certain pod is installed, you can go to this file and check it. And the second file, manifest.log, it's a copy of podfile.log. It gets created every time when you run pod install. So if you are getting an error like the sandbox is not in sync with the podfile.log, it's because this file is no longer the same as a podfile.log. So since the pods directory is not always under version control, this is the way of making sure that you update pods every time before you run the project. Otherwise, the app would crash and build will fail. But yeah, usually, like for this specific kind of error, there's a certain script which is added into a build step, which makes sure that when you run, when you build your target, your app, you run it, and pods are being updated. Yeah, so that's about pod install command. Yeah, and now I'll summarize what we learned today. So basically, we learned that CocoaPods is a library, dependency management tool for iOS and macOS application. It's been widely used, and I think it's one of the mostly used even after Swift Package Manager release. But other alternative to CocoaPods is a Swift Package Manager and Cartridge. Also, we talked about steps or like installation steps of CocoaPods, and we mentioned that on M1 Max there are some additional steps may be required to deal with it. But of course, I didn't cover all the possible cases, all the possible issues which may arise during installation M1 Max. Like in general, the goal of CocoaPods is to improve discoverability and engagement with third-party open source libraries. And one more goal is to promote code reusability. So you don't repeat yourself. You may rope certain functionality into a library and add it to the project through CocoaPods, and also helps with maintaining the project. Also, we talked a bit about, like, we did a deep dive into what's going on when we run pod install, and this helps us to better understand these processes and why we need this file or that file, and this helps us to build better apps. And also, when you run next time when you run pod install, just add verbose, and you see what, like, all the things which CocoaPods is doing, and it also helps you to learn CocoaPods even more. So there are some useful links. First of all, it's a CocoaPods official website. It has lots of good documentation, explanation how to install CocoaPods, how to create pod file, pod spec, and like there's lots of information if you're interested in not only using CocoaPods in your project, like by adding existing pod, like external pod, but if you're willing to create your own library and make it as a pod, just go there, and it has very good guidance and a couple of more guides and tutorials. And time for questions. Not only questions, also you may share your experience, maybe what issues you had and how you deal with it, how you fixed it. So it would be good to share this knowledge.
Well, it's more a question for you. Did you find it more difficult than other package managers?
Yeah, CocoaPods itself, I mean, it's considered more complex than, for example, like Cartridge. But like for me, I think it's #1 dependency management tool I'm using. Yeah, I mean, it's complex, yeah, but it's powerful, right?
Yeah. You can do more stuff in it.
Yeah, and honestly, once I tried in one of my projects, I tried to use Swift Package Manager primarily, and I stuck with some issues. So even though CocoaPods it's not native, and like Apple always pushes for like using everything native like Swift Package Manager, but still I think CocoaPods, even though it's like a third-party tool, but still it's really powerful, and it's been actively supported. And sometimes when there is some like maybe beta version of Xcode or something, it may break, but they try to keep it up to date, and yeah.
Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, I'm sure, guys, you all had a bunch of issues with CocoaPods, and it would be nice to hear like how you deal with it and how you fix it and what kind of issues. So this can be helpful for others.
I can chime in a little here, I guess. In the past, I've had struggles using CocoaPods when there were internal packages that we were doing. Like we had modularized our code base and we had potential CocoaPods that were not on the public internet, and we had to route them through some VPNs or just some local stuff. And I remember having a lot of issues with that and having to run the pod install 5, 6, 7 times a day. You're laughing because I think that you've probably had to go through that circus before as well, right? Any suggestions?
I mean, I think there's no like probably like a perfect recipe for every different kind of issues. Like for me, it just just you try this, try that, and see what works.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's also what I find is I don't always have the right way to tell people how to solve problems with this. I just have to say you got to keep trying and changing and working through it. That being said, you talked a little bit about Swift Package Manager, and that's been gaining a lot of attraction, especially because how Apple tries to push for those things. What do you see the roadmap is for Swift Package Manager versus CocoaPods in the long term?
Yeah, I think since Apple is pushing SPM, Swift Package Manager, I think it will also grow. Probably in the future, it may like overcome CocoaPods. Just assumption, because if Apple if Apple pushes it, there's the reason. So they wanna like have it like widely used, and but I mean, if they can make like Swift Package Manager a solid like alternative and do everything which CocoaPods does, and I mean more stable, especially like I said, some beta releases, right? For beta releases, CocoaPods may not be good. Yeah, so I think if it grows fast, SPM, I mean, I would use it. I try to use as much as possible all the native stuff because it all depends on Apple. If you depend on some third-party stuff, more risk there.
On third parties, have you found a lot of common frameworks have been migrating from CocoaPods to SPM? Are they on both? Are they keeping it active on both? Just in the industry, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think I don't think there is like a trend of moving to Swift Package Manager from CocoaPods. Like, right now there's a trend of moving from maybe UIKit to Swift UI, like writing some new components with Swift UI. But I don't think like there is such trend with SPM. But I don't know, maybe someone has more information on that. But I think CocoaPods is still strong. It's still widely used, and in some of my projects we had like a SPM and CocoaPods, but I was like, if like you cannot do all stuff in Swift Package Manager, but you can do all stuff in CocoaPods, then just use CocoaPods straight, not like this stuff and that stuff and mix it. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you for answering those questions. I really appreciate that.
Anyone else? All right.
Just one more note, Parag. I know, like I mentioned, this topic is huge. There are many topics which maybe some of you will be interested, like some like error handling with CocoaPods, how cache is working with CocoaPods. And I think these are nice topics for next lightning talks. So keep tuned. And I think in one of the future lightning talks, we'll cover that.
Cool. No, this was very informative. Thanks a lot, Nikolai and Nader, Greg. Thanks for those questions. As a reminder to you all, we do these lightning talks every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern time. And next Thursday, we are taking a break for Thanksgiving, but we'll be back on December 1st with Mike Salito, who is a senior software engineer with us, for an overview of CI/CD for engineers. And he's going to talk about the success of nightly builds. Really looking forward to this talk. So make sure you mark your calendar for December 1st. And thank you all once again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you all next week.